The morning sun painted golden streaks across the lobby of Sunrise Manor, a quiet retirement home tucked away in the hills outside Phoenix. Most days here followed the same peaceful rhythm. Residents would shuffle to breakfast, chat about the weather, maybe play a card game or two. Nothing too exciting ever happened, which was exactly how everyone liked it. That all changed when Edmund Chen arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. At first glance, Edmund looked like any other new resident. He was small and thin, with silver hair that seemed to have a mind of its own. His clothes were simple but clean, and he carried just one worn leather suitcase. What made people notice him wasn't how he looked, but how he moved. While other residents his age needed walkers or wheelchairs, Edmund walked with steady steps. His back was straight, and his dark eyes seemed to take in every detail around him. The staff at Sunrise Manor had seen many residents come and go over the years. They knew the signs of someone struggling with their new life away from home. The confusion, the sadness, the way some people would sit by the window for hours staring at nothing. But Edmund was different. He seemed calm, almost like he had been waiting for this moment his whole life. On his third day at Sunrise Manor, something happened that nobody expected. The community room was mostly empty that afternoon. A few residents were watching an old movie on the television, and two ladies were working on a puzzle near the window. In the corner of the room sat an old upright piano that nobody ever used. It was covered in dust, and several of the keys stuck when you pressed them. The staff had talked about getting rid of it for years, but somehow it always stayed. Edmund had been walking past the room when he stopped. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just staring at the piano. Then, without saying a word to anyone, he walked over to it. He pulled out the small bench and sat down. His fingers touched the keys gently, like he was greeting an old friend. The first few notes he played were soft and careful. He was testing the piano, learning which keys worked and which ones needed extra pressure. What happened next made everyone in the room stop what they were doing. Music filled the air like nothing anyone had ever heard before. It wasn't just someone playing piano. This was something special. Edmund's fingers danced across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible. The melody was beautiful and sad at the same time, telling a story without any words. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been watching her movie, forgot all about it. She turned in her chair and stared at Edmund with her mouth open. The two ladies doing the puzzle stopped completely, their hands frozen over the pieces. Even the staff members in the hallway came to see what was happening. The music went on for about 10 minutes. Edmund played like he was alone in the room, his eyes closed, completely lost in the melody. When the last note faded away, the room was silent except for the sound of people breathing. "Where did you learn to play like that?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez, her voice barely above a whisper. Edmund opened his eyes and looked around as if he had forgotten where he was. He gave a small smile and said, "Oh, I've been playing a little piano my whole life." A little piano. That's what he called it. But everyone who heard him knew this wasn't just a little piano. This was something extraordinary. Word spread quickly through Sunrise Manor. By dinner time, everyone was talking about the new resident who could make magic happen at the old piano. Some residents who hadn't left their rooms in weeks suddenly found reasons to walk past the community room, hoping to catch another performance. The next day, Edmund played again. This time a small crowd gathered. He played different pieces, each one more beautiful than the last. His fingers never stumbled, never hit a wrong note. It was like watching someone speak in a language that everyone understood but nobody could explain. Linda, the activities director, had worked at Sunrise Manor for 15 years. She had organized countless game nights, movie screenings, and craft sessions. She thought she had seen everything. But watching Edmund play made her feel like she was witnessing something truly special. After his performance, she approached him carefully. She didn't want to scare him away or make him feel uncomfortable. "Edmund," she said gently, "that was absolutely beautiful. Have you ever thought about performing for larger groups? Maybe we could arrange something special." Edmund's smile faded just a little. He looked down at his hands, then back at Linda. "Thank you for the kind words," he said. "But I just play for myself these days. It helps me remember." "Remember what?" Linda asked. But Edmund had already stood up from the piano bench. He gave her another small smile and walked away, leaving her question hanging in the air. As the days passed, Edmund's piano playing became the highlight of everyone's day at Sunrise Manor. Residents would time their activities around his performances. The staff would find excuses to walk by the community room when he was playing. Even family members who came to visit would ask about the piano man. But the more Edmund played, the more curious everyone became about his story. He was clearly not just someone who had taken a few piano lessons. The way he played, the pieces he chose, the emotion he put into every note, it all pointed to something much bigger. Dr. Patterson, who visited Sunrise Manor twice a week to check on residents, happened to be there during one of Edmund's performances. He stood in the doorway, listening with amazement. After Edmund finished, Dr. Patterson pulled Linda aside. "I've heard a lot of talented musicians in my time," he said quietly. "But what that man just did, that's not amateur level. That's not even advanced amateur. That's professional, concert-level professional." Linda nodded. She had been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to say it out loud. "Do you think he used to be a professional musician?" "I think," Dr. Patterson said, watching Edmund as he carefully closed the piano lid, "there's a lot more to our new resident than meets the eye." But every time someone tried to ask Edmund about his background, he would give the same gentle smile and the same simple answer. He had been playing a little piano his whole life. That was all he would say. As spring turned into summer, Edmund became a beloved figure at Sunrise Manor. His daily piano performances brought joy to everyone around him. But they also brought questions that nobody could answer. Who was Edmund Chen really? How had someone with such incredible talent ended up in a quiet retirement home in Phoenix? And why, whenever he finished playing, did he look so incredibly sad? The answers to these questions were about to change everything at Sunrise Manor and touch the hearts of people around the world. But for now, all anyone knew was that they were witnessing something truly special every single day, and that was enough to make even the most ordinary moments feel like magic. 3 months had passed since Edmund first touched the keys of the old piano at Sunrise Manor. His daily performances had become the heartbeat of the retirement home. Residents would gather every afternoon at 2 o'clock, waiting for the magic to begin. Even the grumpiest residents, the ones who complained about everything, would sit quietly and listen with smiles on their faces. Edmund had become more comfortable too. He still kept to himself mostly, but he would nod hello to people in the hallways and sometimes even chat about the weather. He had his favorite spot in the dining room where he ate his meals quietly, always polite but never sharing much about his past. Everything changed on a warm August afternoon when Edmund turned 103. The staff at Sunrise Manor had planned a small birthday celebration. Nothing fancy, just cake and coffee in the community room. Linda had invited a few local people who sometimes visited the retirement home to play music or read stories to the residents. She thought Edmund might enjoy meeting other people who loved music. One of the visitors that day was Professor Helen Walsh from the State University. She taught music and had been coming to Sunrise Manor for years, bringing her students to perform for the residents. Professor Walsh was in her 60s with gray hair and kind eyes that seemed to notice everything. She had heard about Edmund from Linda, but had never been there during one of his performances. The birthday party was sweet and simple. Edmund seemed genuinely touched that people had remembered his special day. He thanked everyone and said how happy he was to call Sunrise Manor his home. When someone suggested he play piano for his birthday, Edmund agreed with a shy smile. He walked to the piano and sat down as usual. The room grew quiet, waiting for the familiar magic. But today was different. Maybe it was because it was his birthday, or maybe it was because he was feeling more comfortable, but Edmund began playing something nobody had heard before. The melody was complex and beautiful, with layers of sound that seemed to weave together like a story. His left hand played deep, rich notes while his right hand danced across the higher keys. Sometimes both hands would cross over each other in movements so fast they were almost a blur. Yet every note was perfect, every rhythm exactly right. Professor Walsh sat up straight in her chair. Her coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. She had spent her entire career studying piano music, teaching students, and listening to professionals perform. What she was hearing was extraordinary. The piece Edmund played was challenging enough that only master-level pianists could perform it. But he wasn't just playing the notes correctly. He was bringing emotion to every phrase, telling a story through the music that made people feel things they couldn't put into words. Some residents had tears in their eyes. Others were holding hands, moved by the beauty of what they were hearing. When Edmund finished, the room erupted in applause. Everyone was cheering and wiping their eyes, but Professor Walsh wasn't clapping. She was staring at Edmund with a look of complete shock. As the celebration continued around them, Professor Walsh walked over to Edmund. Her hands were shaking slightly. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Edmund looked up at her with curious eyes. Something in her expression made him nod. They walked to a quiet corner of the room where they could talk without others hearing. "That piece you just played," Professor Walsh said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know what it was?" Edmund tilted his head. "It's something I wrote a long time ago." "Why do you ask?" Professor Walsh took a deep breath. "I've been teaching piano for over 30 years. I know that piece. It's called Memories of Rain, and it was composed by Arthur Chen, one of the most talented pianists who ever lived. But Arthur Chen disappeared over 60 years ago. Nobody knows what happened to him." The color drained from Edmund's face. For a moment, he looked like he might fall down. Professor Walsh reached out to steady him. "Are you all right?" she asked, suddenly worried that she had upset him. Edmund was quiet for a long time. He looked around the room at all the people who had become his friends over the past few months. He saw Linda laughing with residents, the kitchen staff cleaning up cake plates, everyone happy and celebrating his birthday. Finally, he looked back at Professor Walsh. His eyes were filled with something that looked like relief mixed with fear. "My name," he said slowly, "is not really Edmund Chen." Professor Walsh felt her heart skip a beat. "My real name," Edmund continued, his voice getting stronger, "is Arthur Chen, and you're right. I did disappear 60 years ago." The words hung in the air between them. Professor Walsh couldn't believe what she was hearing. Arthur Chen had been a legend in the classical music world. He had performed with the best orchestras, recorded albums that music students still studied today, and was considered one of the most promising pianists of his generation. Then, at the height of his success, he had simply vanished. "But why?" Professor Walsh asked. "You were at the top of your career. You had everything. Why did you walk away from it all?" Edmund's eyes filled with tears. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had just created such beautiful music. "Because," he said, his voice breaking, "my music cost me everything that truly mattered." Professor Walsh wanted to ask more questions, but she could see that Edmund was struggling with emotions he had kept buried for decades. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share," she said softly. But Edmund shook his head. "Maybe it's time," he said. "I've been carrying this secret for so long. Maybe it's time someone finally knew the truth." He took a shaky breath and began to speak. "In 1962, I was supposed to perform at Carnegie Hall. It was the biggest concert of my career. Everything I had worked for my entire life was leading up to that moment. But just hours before I was supposed to go on stage, I got a phone call that changed everything." Professor Walsh waited quietly, sensing that this was a story that had been locked away for far too long. "My daughter," Edmund continued, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. "My beautiful little daughter was rushing to get to my concert. She wanted to surprise me by being there. But there was an accident, a terrible accident, and by the time I got to the hospital, he couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to." Professor Walsh understood. "I never performed that night," Edmund said. "I couldn't. Instead, I sat by her bedside and blamed myself for everything. If I hadn't been so focused on my career, if I hadn't needed to be the center of attention, if I had just been a normal father instead of chasing fame, she would still be alive." The community room around them was still filled with the sounds of celebration. But in their quiet corner, two people sat with the weight of a story that had been hidden for over 6 decades. "So I walked away from everything," Edmund said. "I changed my name, moved across the country, and promised myself I would never perform publicly again. I've spent 61 years keeping that promise." Professor Walsh sat in stunned silence. She had discovered one of the greatest mysteries in classical music history. But more than that, she had found a man who had been carrying an incredible burden of grief and guilt for most of his life. "Arthur," she said gently, "what you've been through, I can't imagine. But you're still here. You're still making beautiful music. Maybe that means something." Edmund looked up at her with eyes that held decades of pain. "I don't know," he said. I really don't know. But as he spoke those words, something had changed. For the first time in 61 years, Arthur Chen's secret was no longer his alone to carry. And that was just the beginning of what would become the most surprising chapter of his extraordinary life. The days following Arthur's revelation were quiet and heavy at Sunrise Manor. Professor Walsh had promised to keep his secret until he was ready to share it with others, but the weight of what she had learned seemed to hang in the air between them. Arthur still played piano every afternoon, but something had changed. His music was different now, sadder somehow, as if finally speaking about his past had opened old wounds that had never properly healed. Professor Walsh visited more often now, not as a teacher bringing students, but as a friend who understood the burden Arthur had been carrying. She would sit quietly in the back of the room during his performances, watching the way his fingers moved across the keys with such skill and grace, knowing now that every note carried decades of hidden pain. It was during one of these visits, about a week after his birthday confession, that Arthur finally told her the whole story. They were sitting in the garden behind Sunrise Manor, where residents often went to enjoy the evening air. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Arthur had been quiet for a long time, just watching the birds fly between the trees. Her name was Lily, he said suddenly, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze. She was 7 years old and she had the most beautiful smile you could ever imagine. Professor Walsh turned to look at him, seeing tears already forming in his eyes. She loved music just like I did, Arthur continued. Every morning she would sit next to me at the piano bench and try to copy what I was playing. Her little fingers could barely reach the keys, but she was so determined. She said that someday she wanted to play in big concert halls just like her daddy. He paused, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief he kept in his pocket. The night of the Carnegie Hall concert, I was at the venue doing a final rehearsal. It was December 15th, 1962. I remember everything about that day. What I wore, what I ate for breakfast, even what the weather was like. Some memories stay with you forever. Professor Walsh nodded, understanding that traumatic memories often freeze every detail in place. Lily was supposed to stay home with her mother, Arthur said. The concert was on a school night and we thought she was too young to stay up so late. But she had been talking about this concert for weeks. She was so proud of me, so excited to see me play at the most famous concert hall in the world. Arthur's voice cracked as he continued. What I didn't know was that she had convinced her mother to bring her anyway. They were driving through the city, trying to get to Carnegie Hall before the show started. Lily was in the back seat, probably bouncing up and down with excitement like she always did when we went somewhere special. The garden around them was peaceful, with only the sounds of evening birds and distant traffic, but Arthur was lost in a memory from over 60 years ago, reliving the worst night of his life. The phone call came just 2 hours before I was supposed to go on stage, he said. I was backstage getting ready when someone handed me the phone. It was the hospital. There had been an accident. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit their car. Professor Walsh felt her own eyes filling with tears, knowing what was coming next. I left everything and ran to the hospital. I didn't care about the concert, the audience, or my career. None of that mattered anymore. When I got there, my wife was in surgery and Lily... Arthur stopped speaking for a moment, unable to continue. The doctors said she died instantly, he finally managed to say. They said she didn't suffer, that she was probably still thinking about the concert she was coming to see. They found a drawing in her coat pocket that she had made for me. It was a picture of me playing piano, and she had written "Good luck, Daddy" at the bottom in her messy 7-year-old handwriting. Professor Walsh reached over and took Arthur's hand. She didn't say anything because there weren't words for this kind of pain. I stayed at the hospital all night, Arthur continued. I held her hand and told her I was sorry. I kept thinking that if I hadn't needed to be famous, if I hadn't scheduled that concert, if I had just been a regular father who came home from work every day instead of traveling around the world playing piano, she would still be alive. Arthur pulled the handkerchief from his pocket and carefully unfolded it. Inside was a small worn piece of paper with a child's drawing on it. The colors had faded over the years, but you could still see a stick figure at a piano, and the words "Good luck, Daddy" written in crayon. I've carried this with me every day for 61 years, he said, showing the drawing to Professor Walsh. It's all I have left of her. Professor Walsh looked at the precious drawing. understanding now why Arthur had disappeared from the music world. The guilt and grief had been too much to bear. "What happened after that night?" she asked gently. "The newspapers wrote stories about the mysterious disappearance of Arthur Chen," he said. "Some people thought I had stage fright. Others wondered if I had been in an accident myself. A few people suspected something tragic had happened, but nobody knew the truth." Arthur folded the drawing carefully and put it back in his pocket. "I legally changed my name to Edmund Chen a few months later," he continued. "I moved to a small town in Colorado and got a job tuning pianos for a music store. I thought if I could still be around music without performing, maybe I could find some peace. But every time I touched a piano, I thought about Lily and how she would never get to learn to play like she dreamed." "Did you ever see your wife again?" Professor Walsh asked. Arthur nodded sadly. "She recovered from her injuries, but she blamed me just as much as I blamed myself. She said I had always loved my music more than my family, and that my selfishness had cost us our daughter. She was right. We divorced 6 months later, and she moved away. I never saw her again." The sun had almost completely set now, leaving them in the gentle darkness of early evening. Arthur's story hung between them like a heavy cloud. "For 60 years I lived quietly," he said. "I tuned pianos during the day and went home to an empty apartment at night. I never married again, never had other children. I felt like I didn't deserve happiness after what had happened. The only time I played piano was when I was completely alone, and even then, I would think about Lily and wonder what kind of pianist she might have become." "But you never stopped playing completely," Professor Walsh observed. "No," Arthur said. "I couldn't. Music was the only way I could still feel connected to her. When I played, especially the pieces I had been working on when she was alive, it was like she was sitting next to me on the piano bench again, trying to copy what I was doing with her little fingers." Professor Walsh sat quietly, overwhelmed by the depth of Arthur's story. She understood now why his music was so filled with emotion, why every note seemed to carry the weight of decades of love and loss. "Arthur," she said finally, "what you went through was heartbreaking, but you've survived it. You're here, you're still making beautiful music, and you've brought joy to so many people at Sunrise Manor. Maybe Lily would be proud of that." Arthur looked at her with eyes that held a lifetime of pain, but also, for the first time in many years, the smallest glimmer of hope. "Do you really think so?" he asked. "I do," Professor Walsh said firmly, "and I think your story deserves to be told." Neither of them knew it yet, but those words would soon change everything. Professor Walsh couldn't stop thinking about Arthur's story. For 3 days after their conversation in the garden, she found herself distracted during her classes, her mind wandering back to the image of a broken-hearted father, carrying his daughter's drawing for 61 years. She knew she had promised to keep his secret, but she also felt strongly that Arthur's story deserved to be shared with the world. Finally, she made a decision that would change everything. On a Thursday morning, Professor Walsh asked Arthur if she could speak with him privately. They met in the same quiet corner of the community room where he had first revealed his identity. "Arthur," she said carefully, "I've been thinking about what you told me. I know you've spent decades hiding from the world, but I wonder if it's time to stop hiding." Arthur looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, your story could help people," Professor Walsh explained. "There are parents out there who have lost children, people who are carrying guilt and pain just like you have been. Maybe sharing what you've been through could give them hope." Arthur shook his head immediately. "No, I couldn't. I've lived quietly for so long. I don't want attention or pity." "This wouldn't be about pity," Professor Walsh said gently. "This would be about showing people that even after the worst possible tragedy, it's possible to keep going. You've survived something that would have destroyed most people, and you're still here, still creating beautiful music." Arthur was quiet for a long time, considering her words. Finally, he looked up at her with uncertain eyes. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked. Professor Walsh took a deep breath. "I'd like to write about your story. Not for a newspaper or magazine, but just to share online. Let people know that Arthur Chen is alive and tell them why you disappeared. But only if you give me permission." Arthur felt his heart racing. The idea of the world knowing his story terrified him. But at the same time, after carrying this secret alone for so many years, there was something appealing about finally letting it go. "If I said yes," he said slowly, What would happen? I don't know, Professor Walsh admitted honestly. Maybe nothing. Maybe a few people would read it and that would be the end of it. Or maybe people would be touched by your story. Either way, it would be your choice. Arthur spent 2 more days thinking about it. He watched the other residents at Sunrise Manor, people who had accepted him and grown to love his music without knowing anything about his past. He thought about Lily and what she might want him to do. Finally, on Saturday morning, he found Professor Walsh and gave her his answer. "Okay," he said quietly. "You can tell my story." Professor Walsh spent the entire weekend writing. She told Arthur's story with care and respect, focusing on his love for his daughter, the tragedy that changed his life, and his decades of quiet survival. She ended by describing his daily piano performances at Sunrise Manor, and how his music continued to bring joy to people even after all these years. On Monday morning, she posted the story on social media and sent it to a few friends who were also musicians. Then she waited. At first, nothing happened. A few people liked the post and a couple of friends left kind comments. Professor Walsh began to think that maybe Arthur's story would remain a quiet tribute, shared by just a small number of people who appreciated classical music. But on Tuesday, something unexpected began to happen. The story started getting shared, first by music teachers, then by people who had lost loved ones, then by others who were simply moved by Arthur's journey. Each person who shared it added their own comments about how the story had touched them. By Wednesday, the post had been shared hundreds of times. By Thursday, it was in the thousands. Local news stations began picking up the story, and by Friday, Arthur Chen was trending on multiple social media platforms. The response was overwhelming, but what surprised everyone most was how positive it was. Instead of treating Arthur like a curiosity or a tragic figure, people were celebrating his courage and his music. They were sharing their own stories of loss and survival, creating a community of people who understood grief and healing. At Sunrise Manor, the staff had to start turning away reporters and visitors. Everyone wanted to meet Arthur, to hear him play, to shake the hand of the man who had touched so many hearts with his story. But the most surprising responses came from people Arthur never expected to hear from again. On Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after Professor Walsh had posted his story, Linda brought Arthur an envelope that had arrived in the morning mail. The return address made Arthur's hands shake. It was from his old record label in New York. With trembling fingers, Arthur opened the letter. It was from the current president of the company, a woman named Catherine Rodriguez, who had grown up listening to Arthur's old recordings. "Dear Arthur," the letter began, "we never forgot you. When you disappeared in 1962, we kept all of your unreleased recordings in our vault, hoping that someday you might return. Now that we know what happened, we want you to know that we still have them and we would be honored to release them if you're interested, not for profit, but as a tribute to your daughter and to share your beautiful music with a new generation." Arthur read the letter 3 times before he could fully believe it. Music he had recorded over 60 years ago was still waiting for him, but that wasn't the most shocking surprise. On Sunday afternoon, Arthur was sitting in the garden when Linda approached him with a nervous expression. "Arthur," she said gently, "there are some people here to see you. They've been driving all night to get here." Arthur looked confused. "Who would drive all night to see me?" Linda smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. "Your children," she said. Arthur felt like the world had stopped spinning. "My children? But I don't have—" "You do," Linda said softly. 3 of them. They're adults now, of course, but they've been looking for you for decades." Arthur's mind raced back to his early 20s before he was famous, before he met Lily's mother. There had been someone else, a relationship that ended when his career began taking off. She had told him she was pregnant, but he had been so focused on his music that he hadn't been the partner or father he should have been. When she moved away, he had convinced himself it was for the best. "They want to meet you," Linda continued. "They found out about your story online and realized you were their father. They've been searching for Edmund Chen, not knowing you had changed your name." Arthur's legs felt weak. Children. He had other children who had grown up without him, and now they were here. "Are you ready to see them?" Linda asked. Arthur nodded, unable to speak. As he walked back toward Sunrise Manor, his mind was spinning with emotions he hadn't felt in decades. Fear, hope, excitement, and overwhelming gratitude that maybe, after 61 years of carrying his guilt alone, he might finally have a chance to be part of a family again. The three adults waiting for him in the lobby looked nervous and excited. They had his eyes, his gentle smile, and when they saw him, they all started crying at once. For the first time since 1962, Arthur Chen was surrounded by people who shared his blood and wanted nothing more than to know their father. The healing he never thought possible was finally beginning, but this was just the start of what would become the most incredible week of his life. The reunion with his children was everything Arthur never dared to dream possible. David, now 58 and a high school music teacher, had Arthur's same gentle way of speaking. Patricia, 55 and a nurse, had inherited his expressive eyes. And Robert, the youngest at 52, worked as a piano tuner, just like Arthur had done for decades. They spent hours talking, sharing stories, and filling in the gaps of a lifetime spent apart. Arthur learned that their mother had told them wonderful things about him, how talented he was, how much he had loved music. She had never spoken badly about him, even though he had let them down by not being there when they were growing up. "We always knew you were our father," Patricia said, holding Arthur's weathered hand. "Mom kept newspaper clippings of your concerts and played your records for us when we were kids. She said you were following your dreams and that we should be proud of you." Arthur felt a mix of gratitude and regret that was almost too much to bear. These three beautiful people had grown up knowing about him, loving him from a distance while he had spent 60 years thinking he was completely alone in the world. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I should have been there for you. I should have been a better father." "You're here now," David said simply. "That's what matters." As word spread that Arthur's children had found him, the story captured even more hearts around the world. People were moved by the idea of a family reunited after so many decades, and by the grace and forgiveness his children showed him. The requests for interviews and appearances kept pouring in, but Arthur wasn't interested in fame or attention. He was content to spend time getting to know his children and grandchildren, and to continue his quiet life at Sunrise Manor. But fate had one more surprise in store. 2 weeks after his children's arrival, Linda approached Arthur with an unusual request. The Phoenix Symphony Orchestra had been following his story, and they wanted to do something special for his upcoming 104th birthday. "They want to come here," Linda explained, "to Sunrise Manor. They want to perform some of your original compositions for you and the other residents." Arthur was touched but hesitant. "That's very kind, but they don't need to do that for me." "Actually," Linda said with a mysterious smile, "I think they do. There's something else. Your old record label wants to be here too. They're bringing some equipment to record the event. And they want to release a new album featuring your unreleased music from the 1960s. All the proceeds will go to a charity of your choice." Arthur felt overwhelmed. After 61 years of hiding, suddenly the whole world seemed to want to celebrate him. It felt surreal, almost like a dream. His children encouraged him to accept. "Dad," Robert said, using the word that still made Arthur's heart skip a beat, "you've spent so long thinking your music brought tragedy. Maybe it's time to let it bring joy again." So Arthur agreed. The day of his 104th birthday arrived with perfect weather. The staff at Sunrise Manor had transformed the community room and the garden area into a concert space. Members of the Phoenix Symphony Orchestra arrived early in the morning, carrying their instruments and setting up music stands. Arthur sat in a place of honor, surrounded by his 3 children, his grandchildren who had flown in from different states, and all the residents and staff who had become his family at Sunrise Manor. Professor Walsh was there too, amazed at how sharing Arthur's story had led to this incredible moment. The orchestra began with a beautiful piece by Mozart, Arthur's favorite composer. Then they played some of the original compositions Arthur had written in the early 1960s, pieces that hadn't been heard in public for over 60 years. Arthur listened with tears in his eyes, remembering when he had first written these melodies. Back then he had been young and ambitious, dreaming of fame and success. He never could have imagined that his music would be performed decades later, in a retirement home, surrounded by a family he thought he had lost forever. But the most incredible moment was still to come. As the orchestra finished their final piece, the conductor stood up and addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we have one more surprise. Mr. Arthur Chen, would you consider joining us for one final performance?" Arthur's eyes went wide. He looked at his children, who were all smiling and nodding encouragingly. "We can't force you," the conductor continued, "but we brought a beautiful grand piano just in case. It would be an honor to accompany you." The room fell completely silent. Everyone understood what a momentous decision this was. Arthur hadn't performed publicly in over 60 years. This would be his first time on stage since the night his world fell apart. Arthur stood up slowly, his legs shaky with nerves and emotion. He walked toward the grand piano that had been placed at the front of the room. The bench was the same height as the old upright piano he had been playing for months, but this instrument was magnificent, its black surface gleaming under the lights. He sat down and placed his fingers on the keys. For a moment he just sat there, feeling the weight of 6 decades of grief and guilt, but also feeling something new, hope, love, and the possibility of healing. Then he began to play. The piece he chose was Memories of Rain, the same composition he had played at his birthday party months ago, the one that had revealed his identity to Professor Walsh. But this time he wasn't playing it alone. The orchestra joined him, their instruments weaving together with his piano to create something magical. As Arthur played, something remarkable happened. He wasn't thinking about the tragedy that had haunted him for so long. Instead, he was thinking about Lily, but in a new way. He imagined her as she would be now, a grown woman who might have become a musician herself. He imagined her watching this performance and feeling proud of her father, not for his fame or success, but for his courage to keep going even after losing everything. The music filled the room and spilled out into the garden, where people had gathered to listen. Some residents of Sunrise Manor had never heard live orchestral music before, and they sat with wonder in their eyes. Arthur's grandchildren recorded the performance on their phones, capturing a moment they knew they would treasure forever. When the last note faded away, the room erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. People were crying, cheering, and embracing each other. Arthur sat at the piano, overwhelmed by the love and support surrounding him. But the most beautiful moment came when his youngest granddaughter, a 7-year-old named Hope, walked up to the piano. She was exactly the same age Lily had been when she died. "Grandpa," she said in a sweet, clear voice, "that was the most beautiful music I've ever heard. Someday I want to play piano just like you." Arthur looked down at this precious child, and for the first time in 61 years, he felt joy instead of pain when he thought about a 7-year-old girl who loved music. The event was live-streamed around the world, reaching over 2 million viewers who watched this incredible story of redemption unfold in real time. But more importantly than any audience, Arthur had finally found peace. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Arthur announced his decision about the charity that would receive the proceeds from his new album. He was creating the Lily Chen Foundation, dedicated to helping families who had experienced tragic loss find hope and healing through music. "My daughter never got the chance to grow up and make music," Arthur said to the small group gathered around him. "But maybe through this foundation other children will get that chance. Maybe some good can finally come from all this pain." As Arthur prepared for bed that night, he carefully unfolded Lily's drawing from his handkerchief, just as he had done every night for 61 years. But tonight, instead of feeling only sadness when he looked at it, he felt gratitude. Gratitude for the time he had with her. Gratitude for the children and grandchildren who had found him. And gratitude for the music that had carried him through the darkest period of his life. At 104 years old, Arthur Chen had finally learned that it was possible to honor the past while embracing the future. And his music, which had once felt like a curse, had become the greatest blessing of his extraordinarily long life.